and welcome to today's adventure out on Zoom, talking about migration and transportation expert resources. Before we get started, I will tell you that there is one more handout. It totals 3 handouts for this presentation. After the presentation, I will send that handout also to down to Mary so that she can send it out to all the state participants, excluding Great Falls. And at Great Falls, I will make sure that I mail that out right after the presentation. What you've got today for handout materials, and I'm going to, let's see, I'm going to do this. I'm going to the share screen. I'm going to show you the things that I have given you today. One is a single page handout called Finding Migration Data. Hopefully you can all see that for the particular thing. And it's 2 pages. You need to be particularly concerned with the back side of that page when you do that. Okay, I'll stop the share on that one. I'm going to go back and I'm going to share another one called Transportation Routes, Migration and Transportation Expert Resources. These are the people that I count on. They are experts on migration. What happened in migration across diasporas, across various organizations like the Puritans and the Pilgrims and so on who first came to America, or those who went, for instance, to Australia and so on. And so this is about 6 pages long, and it will give you the latest, and it gives you my little overview in red of what I think of those. At the top, I name them, and sometimes in superscript at the end, you'll see who recommended that particular thing and all about it. Do I have them all? No, I would be really happy if I did, but if you've got some you want to share with me, I'm happy to have you do that. So I'll stop that one, and I will go back out, hopefully to the share screen. And the one that you don't have, but you will be getting, is Notes on Migration Paths, Trails, and Routes. That's today's presentation. It will largely show you all of this. It's 3 pages, and immediately after the presentation, I will be mailing that out to you. So you'll be able to see that particular one. No, I can't mail it now. I didn't do this early on because, frankly, I had some other notes I wanted to include for you. But it does go pretty well through these things today. So I will stop the share on that. And with this, I'm going to start the share screen to actually go into my presentation, and I will go to the slideshow. At least I hope I will. There we go. Here we go. Hopefully you can see that. Diane, can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. All right, and I will try to get rid of that. So how did your ancestor or ancestors get to a particular place? We were just listening to one of the participants say, well, they only knew that the person came in by Milwaukee train, but not any more than that. And that's just a fine place to start. I'm going to be talking just a little bit about some sources and places you can go to find out where that Milwaukee road train actually started, and why did your ancestor take that? It was cheap, by the way. And did he or she travel with friends or family? What was happening in their lives? We're going to examine the migrations of people. Like, why did they go? That's one of the first things. If you've got family stories that have told you that, for instance, my husband's grandfather and grandmother were on their way to Bozeman when the train actually stopped, and they went to see a cousin in Harleton, Montana. And suddenly they decided that they would be the dentist and wife for Harleton, Montana. Well, they wouldn't probably have gone there if not for Cousin Will. Who went with them? Well, just their child at that point. But over the next 4 decades, there were plenty of family members who came there, settled, and did neat things with the school system and with the town and helped Harlowton, Montana grow. We know this because records are always being created. When a town like Harlowton is being built, there's going to be if they start a water system, there's going to be water records. Yes, they exist for most places, especially if they ever became a municipality. There is going to be city directories and county directories. There's going to be all kinds of jurisdictional records for the people who got put in the hoosegow, the jail, that is. There's going to be territorial records for who came in and who went out. There might be passenger lists. Now, not so much on trains, but I'm going to tell you right now that if you're interested in the passenger list for trains for my town or for Helena, or I can tell you Harlowton, some of the Glendive, I know, those papers actually did in their gossip columns, they would mention, maybe not everyone who climbed off the train that week, but a significant number, or who was climbing on the train to go elsewhere. You're going to find that if you're looking for those fellas, especially because ladies, unless we were widower women, we didn't get taxed with the poor tax. It would have been called a poll tax. There's going to be things like road taxes, very, very common in all the territories, and the poor tax also. Maybe there's going to be census information for the territories for sure, or for states. And if you're lucky, you might be in some of the states who used federal census background to actually make their own every 5-year state census. And that could be a very, very cool thing for you. Pay attention particularly to movement across place and time, because those have big, big dividends for you as you're beginning to look at how people came in, how they left, how they came and left again. We need to get a sense of what our ancestors knew in advance before they migrated to a place. It's going to surprise you, but you're going to be able to go out to WorldCat, for example, and find all of the old travel logs, find the old travel literature that people had. Maybe it was a letter from someone that sparked and said, well, there's a bunch of us all here from this town or from this place in Silesia. We'll all be able to speak the same language, so let's all travel to this particular place in Minnesota and live. If you've got an ancestor who came in a little late, who had gone before her to that place? Did she have friends? Maybe some neighbors, or maybe somebody she was thinking of marrying, or relatives, or was he on his own? Were there orphans? If you haven't investigated the orphan train literature, you need to do that in movements across the Midwest of the United States, especially. Noting the historical migration patterns and the timelines that you make and that you find are really going to help you, because otherwise you are sooner or later going to ask questions and say, well, I just don't get how and why they came to that community and why they only stayed for 20 years and then left, or why they came but they didn't have land. Why can't I find more information about them? That timeline is a must, including the information commonly known in the particular area. So go in and read the gossip columns. We're really lucky to have sites like genealogybank.com and newspapers.com, and there's many others. States like Wyoming, California, and Texas have their own newspaper places that you can go to. And by the way, on February 15, I think it is, the next one, I'm actually going to be talking about newspapers and where you could find them and how you can make your own newspaper list if you're trying to find more information about your family. But that timeline is a must. And getting maps, that's going to be a major help to you. Here's a really neat one. It's called The American Traveler, or Guide Through the United States, containing brief notices of the several states, cities, principal towns, canals, and railroads, with tables of distances by stage, by canal, and steamboat routes. It's the whole kind of thing. Started in 1840, I kid you not. And you can find this out online. It's free. I'm going to acquaint you with a couple of new books that we just got in the library, and I'm going to highly recommend these to you because I believe that they can really help you. These are on your migration and transportation expert resources list if you look under Bill Dollarhide. But I'm going to alert you to these because they just came out and they are based on this American Traveler book. Bill Dollarhide has been interested for 3 decades in how people got different places via canal, railroad, tracks, military roads, etc. And what he's done is taken this American Traveler guide and not rewritten it, but showed the maps of the time and then shows the maps of today and gives you guidance in order to be able to travel to a particular place. Oh, by the way, he also gives you within the book pages and pages and pages of information about travel logs, about places to get information on migrations within these books. They're about $39.95 a piece, so they're a little spendy, but we have them in our library now, and they are well worth your time so that you begin to gain a broader perspective of what happened. And knowing that they came in on a particular train is one, but it's not enough to begin to give you that perspective you have when you're trying to consider where they might have come from, who they came with, who were they staying with, and so on. But this American Traveler, by the 6th edition, does include, for instance, some things a little later, after 1846, about who came into Fort Benton, Montana via those steamboats. That's pretty cool. So the American Traveler, or Guide to the United States, is available full text out at the Library of Congress online site. And I would maybe copy this down, although I'll tell you, I did include it in your notes. There's 180 images translated. That's maps. Take just a half hour and tour through those maps. If you're out at the Library of Congress site, you could put in quotation marks at their search site, you can put in the American Traveler. And I got it to come up for me by doing that. Just take a half hour, whip through these things. This is what Dollarhide used in these latest 2 books that he's got. The first one I'm showing you here is titled American Migration Routes, Part 1, the Indian Paths, the Post Roads, the Wagon Roads. At the end, he also does a total tour, if you will, of the Trail of Tears when so many Cherokees were taken to the Oklahoma area. So that's part 1. Part 2 is American Migration Routes, Part 2, stagecoach, steamboat, canal, and early railroad routes. And I'll tell you, he does this mainly, I would say up to and including some areas out of Denver. You will see a little bit of Montana. You won't see the west part in full, but I'll show you and tell you how to get hold of that because there's other materials for you to look at. But I think these are essential. He's updated something that he did in 1997. He went from like 35 pages to several hundred pages. It's well worth your value. They allow you to repeat the journey, towns and way stops for 314 travel routes that were available in 1840 up through, actually, when you look at the things that were added in, up through about 1875. And the exact roads needed so that you can repeat that journey today. And they were all these specific travel routes described by the author Henry S. Tanner He published this in 1840, and it was around for a long time. It's still around for you to look at, and it's the basis. Even though you're going to see that he named them one thing maybe, and then he tells them something else, because they got some kind of famous names from people who were migrating down them. You're going to look at westward expansion across territories. So we had steamboat travel all the way up the Missouri to Fort Benton by 1846 or so. And that went on, folks, until the 1890s when we got the first trains in. When we got the first trains in, they couldn't beat that time up the Missouri anyway. And those steamboats went by the wayside. I'm going to tell you right now, though, if you are someone from Montana or the West and you think your family or your military person from Fort Assiniboine or Fort Shaw came up on that Missouri River via those steamboats, because that's how many of them came, there are lists of passengers for these boats. Just contact the archivist down at Fort Benton. By the way, if you're saying, well, that won't do me because I need to know who came to get them. That's who I'm confused by. Well, look for the list of hotel guests right in the newspaper at Fort Benton and in the newspapers in the Erie Canal cities, in the various cities, seaboard wise. You may see a list of hotel guests who have checked in, who are coming to meet those people, or you'll even see those lists of passengers also check in and who they checked in with. Those lists of hotel guests, by the way, in newspapers like the Great Falls Tribune and the Helena newspapers, the Butte newspapers, the Bozeman Chronicle, those all occurred until the early 1940s, when we had some security problems with naming those guests. So you're going to see guests not just about people who were coming in migration-wise, but who came into town on weekends. Of course, you know, sometimes there is the humorous or not so humorous thing when Mrs. Smith reads the Weekly Tribune a week later and finds out that her husband, Mr. Smith, was in town at the Milwaukee Hotel, and Mrs. Smith was with him. She wasn't there. You can look at Erie Canal and other canal routes, because those are some of the first things that we considered once we weren't just traveling in boats up and down the eastern seaboard or in the Caribbean. We considered how could we still utilize water routes and various canals to get to various places. And the main thing here was people who were starting businesses, agriculture businesses, hardware businesses, and so on, had to have a way to get their stock or to send their stock out from a particular place. It opened trade routes big time, and it eased passenger and commercial travel. It connected the river routes and the rail travel. And again, you want to look in the newspapers. We are having such a neat time with newspapers today because you can check the hotel lists. Generally, there might be, for instance, in Great Falls, there were usually 4 or 5 of the larger hotels who actually used it kind of as an ad for themselves. And they proudly listed all their check-ins. And where the people came in. They might even notice them in something like the gossip column for the week. You can go out and look at 19th century U.S. canals, an index of internet resources. I will give you that. That will be in your notes. Another great place to source this in the first place is go out to the Family Search Wiki and put in the descriptor U.S. migration trails. You're going to get just lots and lots and lots of help. Well, the King's Road was very important in colonial times in what became the United States from about 1700 to 1750. It was a coastal route, and it was very primitive, rough wagon road, very, very tough. It was a postal trail between some colonies that they had by 1735. By 1750, it linked them all. It doesn't mean it linked them well, but it linked them all. So by 1750, they were using seaports. They were using river ports, and as far as they could go up a river. They were using lake ports, and that's going to be valuable to you because there were records created. Even if it wasn't the names of people, it was the name of the captain, and that might be in your ancestors' record. I came up with Captain Phil in 1742. Well, then you know that if you look, you're going to find the boat and at least be able to write a paragraph about your family from that particular record. There's lots of postal records, again, mainly linked to the post offices that were created. Remember, in those early newspapers, earliest of all, you will always find a list of letters that have come in, and people have not come to pick them up, and so they are listed in the newspaper. That is just really, really valuable. It's one of the only ways in which I found one of my family members by 1740 in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. So check these newspapers. Newspapers.com. Yes, it costs money. We have resources for you here in our library. Genealogybank.com. Yes, that one costs money too, but we also have those resources here. And I'm just naming 2 of about 6 big ones. Again, go out to your state historical societies and investigate what they have done with their newspapers. Next time, I'm going to be showing you how to curate those quickly and make a list so that you don't waste your time. You can see here one of the particular roads all the way from Boston, all the way down into what became Wilmington, North Carolina, and what really during that time that this map shows it all through South Carolina. Don't get the idea that they were really neat maps, but people could, and they did, take those particular routes. The colonial trails to 1750 might have even been corduroy roads across swamps or across swamplands as a means to be able to put a road where it had been impossible to find a road before. That King's Highway on the coast, the Lancaster Road, which becomes part of that, by the way, the Great Valley Road, which a little later was known as the Philadelphia Wagon Road, but it went way further than Philadelphia. The Fall Line Road went across Virginia and down to Georgia. The Pioneers Road, the Upper Road Wagon Route into the Carolinas, and he has Insta-guides. I'm not trying to shill for Bill Dollarhide here. I'm just telling you, he has some great things if you're beginning to look at these and you need the assistance to figure out where that family came from or where it was going. This is just a picture early on of Philadelphia and the Lancaster Road, Pennsylvania, the Wagon Road, and also known as, at various times, the Virginia Turnpike. Remember, Virginia, colonial times, was stretched all the way to what is now today Kentucky and part of Indiana and Tennessee. The Braddock and Forbes roads. And I'm just mentioning those because what I'm hoping today that you get is that you get just an idea, or you say, that sounds vaguely familiar. That's whatever, so that you begin to investigate these. The deeper you go into these, the more you're going to find out, and you're going to have a richer experience in taking a look at your ancestors and seeing where they came from and where their friends came from. These roads were made because they were military roads in the French and Indian War era, way back there before 1763. But they created the Western migration trails as a result. And there are records of some travelers and records of some town formations. Sometimes you have to look in those French and Indian War military books to be able to find them. The Lancaster Road, in fact, was built partly as a military, but some of it was already there. So they just took advantage of that, and it was extended later. So by 1750, all of these colonial roads that have been identified, there's a lot of them. And you can see why even after we became a country and we said, well, we're not going to push west, people pushed west relentlessly because they could. There were Great Valley roads. There were Lancaster roads. There were trails over to the Mohawk Trail, over to Lake Ontario, and so on. And people went where they could. There's this Forbes Road in Pennsylvania mainly, and the Braddock Road down in Virginia, and just touching up into what became Pennsylvania. Why did they need these routes? Because they needed to be able to get cannon. They needed to be able to get various things there to fight that French and Indian War. Going westward, 1775, and that, remember, that's when we started seeking our independence, through 1795. You know, we might call it the route by which Daniel Boone went, but it's called the Wilderness Road. Kings Highway was still there and being extended. The Great Valley Road extended into the Kanawha Trail, Fall Line Trails, and then people started using the Ohio River. Yeah, that's right. They had boats and they were going down them. So you can investigate the records that are available for this travel. You're going to do this a couple of ways. You can investigate the actual towns that are on the Ohio River by looking at the Ohio River towns of the day in map books, or out at the Library of Congress, which has fantastic resources for you. You can look at the actual land records that were created, the local military groups that existed, and the military land grants, because people went to the next place because they might have a land grant. I can tell you, we had at least one military land grant person who actually got land here in Great Falls, and it was 90 years later. Just had never been used before. Just a fast look for you at some of these, because the maps were really pretty well put together, and you might not see, for instance, the North Carolina and the Tennessee map line that's been drawn here for you, but here are the maps that took them into this wilderness area. There were state land cessions, of course, in 1787, when we were seeking to become the United States and we put together the U.S. Constitution. People gave up, states gave up their western lands. So Massachusetts gave up the land that it had claimed up in Maine. It gave up the land that it had claimed going westward all the way to what is today Indiana, Illinois. And they became public domain lands that the U.S. government could put settlers on. The Northwest Territory that we're looking at, Indiana, the Michigan area, et cetera, was created by lands from Virginia and Massachusetts and Connecticut. Virginia ceded their Kentucky area. And so remember, when you're looking for, and your family was in Kentucky, if they were there really early, you also need to look at those Virginia records. North Carolina gave up some land that became Tennessee. And Georgia gave up land, which eventually, when you look at it, it's stunning. These became Alabama and Mississippi. So it stretched a long way. And you have to look at those public domain land grant records. I find this map, which I've given you at least once before in another one of my talks. I find this one really good. It's used by many, many people to actually show you how far these claims for land went from these original 13 colonies, all the way at least to that Mississippi River, although there were some that would even claim beyond that. So it's a good, valuable thing to keep in your brain. The Ohio country from 1787 to 1800 went nuts with people coming in. The land sales were limited to private developers, but they created some records, and they found out that they wanted to sell too much land. People couldn't afford to buy large land grants, but there were government land office records. I'm calling them GLOW offices, government land office records in Cincinnati, in Steubenville, Marietta, and Chillicothe. You will find records that are available to you, and a lot of these have been scanned. And there were public land being sold where it shouldn't have been, across the Indian Treaty Line, but it created records. Go look at and investigate the Connecticut records for all the lands that they sold in the Pennsylvania area, and you'll see that it's quite rich for you. And note where the roads were, because this is how your folks got there. Many times they just said that the road was 17 days long, or it was 18 days long, or it was whatever. You're in luck if in one of those diaries, which might be a diary from the time period when your family was there, it might record the ways in which a particular family or sets of families got to a particular place. Here's all the places in what became Ohio, seeing the Lake Trail Path in red, seeing the Great Trail or the Great Path, the Maysville Pike, and so on. So you can get a good idea. If, for instance, I know that my family came in actually and was up in Putnam County and Hancock County. There are a couple of ways they might have made it there, but I can kind of look and say, they were coming from the Pennsylvania area. So this gives me a kind of idea of what I should be looking for and where I should be looking for some of those records. You'll also see that a lot of this land was public domain. And so lots of people came in and settled. They may not have bought the land at the time, but may have gotten it later on. So you have to be aware of what was there, because if you have land that eventually came to the Virginia Military District, there's going to be records for you back in the Virginia archives, probably. The Cumberland National Road, 1818 to 1838, was very heavily traveled. It was a stagecoach route by then. There were wagons that also went down the road because they were carrying goods and services. There's lots of hotels and local inns. You will find the arrivals frequently in the newspapers. Newspaper people, wanted people to get hold of their newspaper. And this is one way for people to find out if there was news about part of the family that had come before them. You can also go to the reading rooms or the libraries and see what there might have been in those towns at that point. This Cumberland National Road extended all the way to Jefferson City, Missouri by 1840. That to me is unbelievable. It was by a stagecoach. I've found great success by looking for letters left at the Jefferson City post office, because there's quite a list frequently. It's not going to be perfect. Sometimes there's passenger arrivals, especially if they were competing stagecoach lines, and there were. They would list who they had or how many they had, and that was an important way for them to advertise. So you'll see this road extending all the way to St. Louis. In the Old Southwest, from 1797 to 1822, there was a whole bunch happening. The land became available as a result of the United States acquiring Spain's land. Remember, they got some Florida land. They got Mississippi Territory, and it was created in 1798. They purchased some of the lands in Florida in 1819, thereby taking all those British Tories who had fled there. They had to flee again to another place, and they created that territory by 1822. There's going to be lots of land records. North Carolina, South Carolina, and Florida. Look for those plats of towns, those county records, the creations of the tax districts, the poll taxes, which you began paying in some states at 18, but in most by 21. The church lists that were there will be records for you. And you can see what these looked like. At the same time, by the way, that Lewis and Clark took their tour of the West, and remember, that was a military particular operation. The same thing was happening down in the Southwest, although that set of explorers was stopped by the Spanish, but those records are available. In fact, we have some of them right here in our library. Your strategy needs to be looking at the land and the water routes carefully, not just hoping that you can put a person's name in and it might magically appear. Although I will tell you, very occasionally that will happen to you if you are out looking at newspapers or you're aware of where to find the records, but you have to have that strategy. You have to examine the land acquisitions in the records, go back to those government land office records to look at what's there, not just the homesteading records from the West, but what happened in the East. Look at the mail routes, because those post office lists of received letters are really important. And they're going to be, if they aren't picked up right away, they might be advertised for several months, giving you an idea of had the person come in there yet, or were they on their way, or whatever. That Natchez Trace extended from the Nashville Road, which came from the Great Valley Road. So you can see how we were going across the United States from east to west. There was a federal horse path mail route, that's tough to say, across the Creek Indian lands. And they also had post office notices. When you look at these maps, it gives you an idea. And so I'm encouraging you strongly to look at the maps so that you get an idea of what was available all in one time period. You're going to go back out to the Library of Congress to look for those particular maps and begin to gain some familiarity of what kind of routes, both water and land, were available to your people. They didn't stay in one place. Frequently, they went and they moved on. The War of 1812 routes improved the South's roads greatly because the roads there were very rudimentary to that time, but the records also improved. They had to be improved to get cannons and wagons and troops to southern locations. And that federal road got traveled by 300,000 settlers between 1812 and 1840. There will be evidence of them in the towns. And the federal road was used by Southern families moving to Texas, for example. So, it's really nice to be able to see the county histories and the family stories and the small town histories and to see who was there. But if you're like me, my family didn't get into those stories, or they traveled on to someplace else. And so they weren't necessarily included in that story. So in order to be able to fill my story in, I have to get beyond those first things. So what about railroad routes? You need to start looking at railroads by 1820. You need to take a look at local newspaper lists of arrivals in the early years, at least from about 1820 to 1840. And the further you go west, the more likely you are to see those newspaper lists of arrivals. If you were in Helena, Montana, or you were in Missoula, or you were out in Spokane, believe me, there was an easy way for the reporter of the day to get some news for the local gossip column of the day. And that was to go down to the train when it came in and look at the arrivals and ask them where they were coming from and what they were doing. You'll see that that fills in a great deal of perspective for you. Here's a railroad guide of all the railroads in Ohio. It was being revised monthly. Yes, we see these. This is in 1887, folks. And where do you find those? I want you to go out to WorldCat. And again, and look for these. And frequently you will find them full text so that you can look at them and see what did your particular person have to look at to make sure of where they were going. Or maybe your person, your ancestor, was like my great grandma, who came into Baltimore in 1886 with herself and 6 children and landed at Pier 6, had a railroad pass to climb on the railroad to go to Minnesota. Her way was certainly provided for by her ticket, but she still had to make sure that she got to the appropriate railroad so that she could take that 2.5, 3-day trip from there to Minnesota. So you're going to look for records both general and specific. Censuses will help you a great deal. Look for everything. Frequently, people did censuses on their own. An example of a nice local census that I can tell you about is that in 1957, the Providence nuns in Great Falls, Montana, made a total census of Hill 57 where indigenous people were living to show the town that there were many people living up there. The names of every family and all of the kids are listed for 1957. And that thing is being used today very, very well. It's a great locator because those people were not listed in the city and county directory for that period of time. It really helps. So you will see censuses. Remember, federals were decennials, like 1790, 1800, 1810, 20, and so on. States like Iowa, Ohio, Nebraska. Nebraska even did a state census every year for several years in the late 1870s, early 1880s. You'll find those done on the 5-year kind of. And you'll find other kinds of censuses. Maybe you're fortunate enough to be in a town that had religious censuses. I found them in Great Falls still being conducted in the 1950s. It's probably only going to tell you the number who were in a particular church, but then if you can get hold of the particular church directory, well, you've really got something for yourself, don't you? There might have been groups of people who traveled together purposefully, like our Germans from Russia. You're going to catch those folks twice. Germans from Russia started coming into the United States in the late 1870s. They had been in Russia for about 100 years as desired farmers. And then the rules changed for them. So they came to the United States and Canada. You're going to find them in ships lists. You're going to find them in local towns in South Dakota, North Dakota, in Canada, especially in the western provinces, in Montana. But you're also going to find those Germans from Russia. There's a neat listing out there, a book, very valuable book, of where they came from in Germany before they went to Russia. You just need to be aware of what's there. By the way, we have that in our library too. Local county records. They're going to have the local road crews. If a family came in, if a guy came in and he were here, it wouldn't take too long to find his name. And they'd say, where are you living? If he lived in Great Falls, he'd be put on a local road crew in town because he had a $2 yearly tax on roads to work off. He could work it off, and that could be proven pretty easily, or he could pay the $2 for the year. In any case, you should look for the local county commission records to find those. And frequently, until about 1930, you'll find those lists in the newspaper. And you'll find the local poll taxes that were paid by people, or even the taxes that were due on January 1 and were not paid. And so you'll find a huge list of people all of January in all of our newspapers in Montana saying, you have 1 month to pay these taxes, and then we're going to take your land. There might be lists of the dependent people, or again, the hotel registrants, the steamboat passenger lists, the ship lists, homestead lists, and you can find those frequently just by looking and saying, oh, this one says in the newspaper he's filed on a homestead, and 3 people have vouched for him. You can look for naturalizations. By the time you get to the western United States with its migration, it's considerable. And of course, you had competing railroads, you had many things there. But what you always had is when people moved in, they were accounted for within county records as soon as possible. Look at the county level. You might also, in the case of municipalities, find municipal records. And of course, you'll find all of the different kinds of directories, the church directories, the city and county directories. You might have school census records for all of these states that you're seeing in front of you. It's just that they might have been guided by some slightly different rules. So you have to check with each state. You can attend a conference to learn. I know I've attended this one, the Mullen Road Conference, a couple of times, and it's coming up again in 2023. The Mullen Road in our area and across Washington and Idaho was it started in Fort Benton, and it was a military trail, and it wasn't meant to be much more than a blaze mark or a way for people to tell where the road needed to be constructed so that they could get all the way through to Washington territory at that point. And you're going to find that all of these roads pretty well, and these various things may have conferences attached or vital books written about them. And I've given you those vital books in the Transportation Expert Resources for some of them to get you started. If you're curious, you're saying, yeah, Jan, you didn't hit any of the ones that I need to know about, then you email me. You have my email right in your invitation today. You can go back to that invitation and see my email and ask me about that, and I'll see what I can help you find. That annual Mullen Trail Conference, by the way, is going to be held in Missoula on June 9 through 11 out at Fort Missoula. It's quite reasonable. I think I paid like $60 last year for 2.5 days. And I heard experts, and I heard researchers and graduate students who were studying a new, fresh area where the Mullen Road has turned into an interstate highway, or a way in which to study a portion of this trail and what no longer exists. You'll get a chance, by the way, to go out on a bus probably and travel part of the original trail. What I'm interested in when I tell you to read books and to attend conferences and to look at those maps, take time to do that, is I want you to begin to get some insights into these trails and routes for research and ways to study these as migration paths, not just a military road for a certain amount of time or whatever, because we're still using them today. The world today is in flux. We have diasporas everywhere. We have what we have considered to be a migration problem coming from South America and from Central America. We can regard that as a problem. It's been regarded as a problem before, but we do have rules. We have to make rules to begin to figure out how we admit or what we do. I encourage you to go out and look at what immigration rules are, to look at migration paths, and to look at what is happening today, how people are getting here. It might surprise you to find out that probably as much as anything, when we're looking at immigration factors today, we might need to look at our north border as much as some people are looking at our south border, because we are still a desirable country. Thank goodness we are. But I encourage you to begin to learn and look at the ways in which your family came to this particular country, or came to Canada, or came to Australia. How did they get there? Where did they move on to? And, since we're in flux, where are we naturally moving today? Many times we only talk about it as travel. But I can tell you that several in my family migrated naturally from Western Montana out to the Seattle area. And I think since they've been there over 30 years, they've kind of settled, and they're the new settlers in that area.